Good evening. Welcome to Grace and Gavel, where truth meets compassion. My name is Buffy. I'm an 18-year criminal defense attorney. And what you can expect on this podcast is that I will not be saying that someone got let out by a technicality, because clearly that's not real legal analysis. Additionally, you can expect compassion for the victims because they were real people. They were loved by others. And many of them their life was taken entirely too soon. And anytime you have a violent crime like that, it is definitely too soon. So today we're talking about Casey Anthony, why the jury acquitted, and why the case still haunts the public. In 2011, America watched one of the most polarizing verdicts in modern criminal history. I actually lived in Orlando during that time. A mother was accused of killing her 2-year-old daughter. The evidence felt overwhelming. The outrage was immediate, and yet the jury said not guilty. This is not an episode about whether you like the verdict. It's about why the verdict happened, what the law required, and what the prosecution failed to prove, and why this case still divides the public more than a decade later. Today, we're talking about Casey Anthony. I also want to share that I was taking the bar exam in 2008 when there was that whole issue going on with Caylee, the daughter. And I just remember getting really weird cold chills when they talked about the pool and they talked about the mom. One of the key things that the mom said was, "It smells like a dead body in the car," and the actual mom, Casey, had been around without her daughter for 30 days. And she was talking about Zanny the nanny, which a lot of people thought was code for Xanax. And there was actually a lady who retained John Morgan from Morgan & Morgan Law in Orlando. That's where he got his start. And I think that actually put him on the map for defamation, because it was assumed that Casey meant that Zenaida. Well, that Zenaida tried to get her for defamation and things like that. I don't think it ended up being successful, but it was just, and honestly, Casey Anthony had ice going through her veins. To be able to literally say, yes, I work at Disney or Universal. I can't remember which one it was now. It's been years now. But yes, I work at this particular place. And she walked them all the way through the place and, saying hi to people and everything else. Turns out she later admitted, yeah, I didn't even work there. So, there was a lot going on there. And apparently she found Jose Baez through when she, I believe, got in trouble for theft. Someone recommended him. That was actually how he got his start. So let's talk about part one. Who was Casey Anthony before the case? Before the trial, Casey Anthony was a 22-year-old woman living in Orlando, Florida. She lived with her parents. She had a strained relationship with them. She was unemployed or underemployed, and she was the mother of a 2-year-old girl, Caylee. The thing about Casey, though, that I think seems to polarize a lot of people is the fact that she doesn't seem to be an honest, sympathetic character. And the thing that gets me is from watching other documentaries during that time when we were there and people talking to people who knew the parents, it was a scenario where they denied that Casey was pregnant until a certain point when it was almost unable to be denied. And they acted like there was nothing wrong with that. And then you go back to the story about how she's accusing her father of abusing her and things like that. Who knows whether or not that's true or not. The only thing I can say is the fact that he has not been convicted of that. He has actually tried to clear his name. So there should be no guilt or innocence construed in this. It's just part of the story. And I believe that he actually took a polygraph and passed, both him and his wife. I know that they got a lot of scrutiny and a lot of abuse from people who maybe didn't fully understand the whole story. Additionally, I will say that one day my husband and I actually did go to the scene and, after it had died down clearly, and realized that literally the dump site was very close and could have been accessed by going through the backyard. That doesn't really say who did it, who didn't do it. But the other thing that you think about too is the fact of how sad it was for this little girl. And there were a lot of people that were really, really upset by that. And it pretty much tore the Anthonys apart. I know Caylee did get acquitted, but my understanding is that she doesn't have a real relationship with her family for whatever reason. And she said a lot of things about her dad, not saying they're true, not saying they're false, because I don't know. And ultimately, I would not get into that debate because I don't have the facts to do that. And that would be very morally and legally irresponsible, which I will not do. So, Casey's life, by her own admission and by testimony, was marked by chronic lying, which we've heard a lot about, avoidance, immaturity, and conflict within the family home. Those traits matter, but not in the way the public often assumes, because being dishonest, irresponsible, or unlikable is not the same thing as being guilty of murder. So just because you may not like someone doesn't mean that they're guilty of anything, right? You may not have made the choices that they made, and that's okay. That's your right. But ultimately, if you're a juror, and it sounds like the jury did what they were called to do, because they likely felt that there wasn't evidence for whatever reason to be able to sustain a conviction. And so they probably didn't like that result, but that result was what was had. And juries are instructed repeatedly to separate moral judgment from legal proof. You cannot base a verdict on a gut feeling. Oh, my gut tells me she did it. She's guilty. You cannot do that. The disappearance of Caylee Anthony. Caylee Anthony was last seen in June 2008. For 31 days, Casey did not report her daughter missing. Instead, she went out socially, told multiple lies about Caylee's whereabouts, claimed a babysitter named Zanny was caring for her child, a person who did not exist, and that is clearly known now. When Caylee was finally reported missing, the story unraveled very quickly. Months later, Caylee's remains were discovered in a wooded area near the Anthony family home, just as I told you. By that point, public opinion was already cemented, but juries are not allowed to convict based on outrage. I truly think, though, that if they had allowed a scene or a view option for the jury, that may have had a different result. They are allowed to convict only on proof beyond a reasonable doubt, which we as citizens want it to continue to be that way. It's not a different standard just because you dislike someone, right? We're all entitled to those specific rights. What the prosecution had to prove and why that matters. The prosecution charged Casey Anthony with first-degree murder, aggravated child abuse, and aggravated manslaughter. First-degree murder in Florida requires proof of intent, premeditation, or a qualifying felony. This is a very high bar. So a qualifying felony is actually would be under the felony murder statute, which would mean, for instance, let's say that I commit a robbery and I happen to be robbing you, and in the process, I kill you. Well, I can be subject to first-degree murder, and those are for violent crimes. For instance, use theft would not be a violent crime, but like robbery, burglary, things like that are very serious, sexual assault, those kind of cases. So it is a very high bar. And the prosecution's theory was Casey intentionally killed Caylee using chloroform and duct tape. But here's the problem. They could not conclusively prove the cause of death because she hadn't been seen for 31 days, time of death, method of death, and in a homicide case, those gaps really matter because it's part of the proof. It's part of the burden that is on the state. And ultimately, I think that they probably would have been better to not just go big or go home by just doing the first-degree murder, but maybe actually get into manslaughter and actually do other levels of murder. Maybe negligent homicide. That would have at least given them a little bit of a verdict or a little bit of a victory. So the forensic weaknesses. The case felt forensic, but much of it was circumstantial. Now, circumstantial is not necessarily a bad thing, but when your entire case rests on what's seemingly a house of cards, it's going to be really difficult to convince people, considering that if she were to be found guilty, she could have life in prison or she could get potentially the death penalty. Those are pretty hefty consequences to just say, okay, let's put it all on red. It's almost like that's what they're saying, and hope that people will be able to read through the lines and want to convict her. So the key issues were no definitive cause of death due to decomposition, because it was actually a meter worker, I believe his name was Roy, I can't remember his last name, who had to go to the bathroom. So he went to the bathroom there and her body was found there. The chloroform evidence was contested and inconclusive. The duct tape evidence was ambiguous at best. I believe there was also something along the lines of where they were trying to see if there was the duct tape, that if it came from the Anthony home. I don't think they were ever able to conclusively prove that. The timeline relied heavily on inference, not certainty. And ultimately, none of us deserve to be convicted of murder based on, I think this is what happened. No, it needs to be proof beyond a reasonable doubt. And ultimately, inference is not certainty, is not surviving the bar of reasonable doubt. Beyond a reasonable doubt. Excuse me, I misspoke. So the jury was left with suspicion, inference, and behavior evidence, but not forensic authority. Okay, so can we say, yes, maybe Casey Anthony wasn't the best mother? Sure, we can say that. But is that something that you are going to give someone the death penalty for? Especially when their evidence is, well, it could be, but maybe, yeah, we think so. That is not beyond a reasonable doubt. And we all are afforded that right. And suspicion, no matter how strong, is not proof. Gut feelings are not proof. Intuition is not proof. Character evidence is specifically restricted for a reason. The only exception to the whole bad man defense is if, let's say, for instance, Casey had a couple other children and they both died under similar circumstances, right? That would potentially be pattern evidence, but that is not what happened. And that is not the case here. So the defense strategy and why it worked. The defense did not have to prove what did happen. And I've said this many times in criminal cases that I've done, criminal defense cases that I've done. I've said, I don't have to prove anything. The burden rests on the prosecution. That is their obligation. Now, if I sat and read the newspaper the whole trial, wouldn't people be wondering what I was doing? Would that potentially hurt my client? Maybe. And that's not something a good defense attorney would do. But ultimately, unless you're proving an affirmative defense, let's say, for instance, she's saying, oh, well, Caylee tried to kill me, right? That would be an affirmative defense for the defendant to prove that someone was endangering their life. So that's why they acted in self-defense. That's the only exception of the defendant having to prove anything. So they only had to introduce reasonable doubt. And clearly, the case was marked with reasonable doubt. Additionally, I always said at the time, especially while living there and following it very closely because it was a very tragic, sad case, I always said that I thought that they shouldn't have arrested Casey as early as they did. Maybe they should have allowed her time to talk, to go out, to do what she was doing for a while with a leash, kind of, in a way. Maybe she didn't know that they were actually looking at her. Would she have confessed? Would she have given them some more information than they were able to get because they acted so quickly? There was also, I believe, a check deception charges, because there was a video of her on Target that was showing constantly. So, I guess maybe in some ways she was probably fortunate to be able to be found not guilty. So essentially, the defense did this, meaning poking holes in the case, by attacking the prosecution's timeline, because clearly no one knew. A lot of it was conjecture. A lot of it was inference. That's not going to get things done. Undermining the forensic conclusions, which they were able to do. I know there was a lot of news media who were actually adding things to the story to kind of sensationalize it, which ultimately, when you have a child, especially a 2-3-year-old child, there's no need to sensationalize that case. I actually have a broadcasting degree and I am an attorney, as I've told you before. And both of those disciplines require ethics and require being honest and truthful. And you already have a hotbed of a case where a child has been murdered. Okay, and we don't need to sensationalize it, make things up just to make it, to make ourselves look better. Because when you are doing something and have other people watching you and listening to you and trusting you, that is a huge responsibility. why cheapen it by lying and sensationalizing things that don't need that already? I mean, they're already hard enough, right? And her grandparents and the people that loved Caylee, they didn't want to hear about all that. And suggesting alternative explanations, which is clearly what a defense attorney would do. And ultimately, they weren't able to prove that it was Casey. So the alternative explanations, so they instead focused on the father. And they had some allegations that they made about him, which upset him and hurt him greatly, which I can imagine. And so he was like their alternative suspect. They also highlighted investigative failures. And clearly, I mean, there were a lot of issues with that as well. And one of the most controversial aspects was the defense's claim that Caylee died accidentally. And so ultimately, I mean, we can't really prove it or disprove it. So ultimately, it was people believed that. Maybe they wanted it out. Maybe they were concerned about the shaky case. And the other thing is, I know that the prosecutor who helped with that case, I believe he failed to be reelected, I believe, or maybe he was elected the state attorney, and then he ended up losing the next term. I can't remember because we moved around that time. So ultimately, I mean, they weren't able to do that. The jury was not asked to believe that theory. They were asked to decide whether the prosecution proved intentional murder, and that is the correct question to ask, because it doesn't matter whether the jury believes it or not. Do they think that it might be feasible? Do they think that it might be rational? Does that make more sense than what the prosecution is actually putting forth? And that's what you have to ask, and that's what they have to ask. By looking at all the evidence, do the pieces line up or do they not line up? And they concluded that the prosecution had not proved it. And that was why the verdict became what it was. The role of George Anthony in investigative gaps. The defense raised questions about family dynamics. They alleged some abuse. They also raised questions about access to the area where Caylee was found. And again, like I said to you, I mean, their house is pretty close to that scene. I'm not blaming anyone. I'm just giving a statement of fact. So yeah, that is a statement of fact. It's not me accusing anyone, because I would not accuse anyone, because I have no idea who committed that crime. And even if I did, I would not say anything, which I do not know anything about it. But just saying, I'm not accusing anyone of doing anything, any wrongdoing whatsoever. And then the law enforcement tunnel vision. A lot of people feel like they focused on Casey and that was it. And Casey was probably a good suspect for them, especially after she went through that issue with kind of leading them by the nose in the wrong direction with the work issue. And ultimately, even though they decided to not convict Casey Anthony, right? Even though they decided that, that doesn't mean that the jury believed someone else committed the murder. It just means they didn't have enough to work with the case. And ultimately, she's not going to be tried again on this because of double jeopardy. You cannot try someone for the same crime twice. I think the one exception was a gentleman who was actually he ended up going to Leavenworth. He had been found not guilty, I believe, in a civilian court, and then he was found guilty. I think he was like court-martialed for the military because he was in the military. But other than that, I mean, and that's also two separate jurisdictions. It meant they were not convinced beyond a reasonable doubt that Casey Anthony intentionally murdered Caylee. That distinction is uncomfortable for some, but legally critical. Why public outrage did not match the verdict. This case became a cultural lightning rod because Caylee was young. Casey's behavior violated maternal expectations. And women, a lot of people have a lot of expectations on what we should and shouldn't do, how we should grieve, how we should act. My previous podcast I did on Darlie is very good evidence of that. Media coverage amplified outrage. The verdict clashed with public intuition. But juries are not allowed to convict someone because their behavior offends social norms. We might not like it. We might not like that person. We may feel really sad and upset that this little girl died. But ultimately, the jury has to do what it's charged to do. They are required to apply the law, even when it's unpopular. Where Caylee Anthony is now, Caylee Anthony was acquitted of murder charges. She was convicted of misdemeanor counts related to lying to law enforcement. She served her sentence. Legally, she cannot be retried for Caylee's death due to double jeopardy. The case is closed, even if the questions remain. So in closing, you can believe Caylee Anthony is responsible for her child's death and believe the jury followed the law. Those positions are not mutually exclusive. This case is not a story about justice denied. It's a story about how high the burden of proof actually is and must be when the state seeks to take away someone's liberty for life. And it's a reminder that the courtroom is not a place for certainty, it's a place for standards. If you value legal clarity over headlines, share this episode and join the conversation. I actually do have a community building here, so if you're interested in that, feel free to drop some comments, ask some questions, give me some topics or cases that you're interested in. I would be more than happy to accommodate that. And I appreciate your support and your listening, and I hope you have a great rest of your day and a great holiday. Bye-bye.